Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. We will be covering Module 61 today, which is assessing intelligence. That word assessing just means to evaluate or to test intelligence. So basically we're looking at intelligence tests. All right, so looking at modern tests of mental ability. There are basically two types of intelligence tests. There are achievement tests, which measure your knowledge in a content area. An example of this would be like the AP exam. There is specific content that you have learned, hopefully, that you are being assessed for. And then there are also aptitude tests, which try to make predictions about what you will do in the future. So like sometimes in the 6th or 7th grade, your school might give you an aptitude test and it'll tell you, hey, you would be a great business owner, or you would make a wonderful accountant, or you definitely need to work with people. The point of a test like that is to assess you to figure out what you will likely do or how you will perform in the future. Typically, the more intelligent you are, the higher you will score on tests. And this is not universally true, but what we have here, these are SAT scores looking at verbal and math scores. And typically people with a lower IQ, if the average is a 100, then 70 would be a lower IQ. Typically those people score lower on the SAT. And then as you go up in IQ, your SAT score also goes up. And so this is not, like I said, universally true. There are some people who are intelligent, but they don't take the SAT well. And so that would be, a skewed result. But in general, people who are intelligent perform better on SAT tests. So one of the first attempts to measure intelligence came from Francis Galton. And if you're thinking in terms of the nature versus nurture debate, this guy would have been on the nature side. So he would have thought that intelligence was entirely genetic. It wasn't something that was formed by your environment. It was something that was formed by your gene pool. And no surprise that he was the cousin of Charles Darwin. And so the idea that nature selects successful traits and then they're passed down to the next generation via survival of the fittest, Galton bought into that. And so he even took it to the extent that we should eliminate people out of the gene pool who are not intelligent. So take the most intelligent people and allow them to reproduce, but take the dull people and not allow them to reproduce. So that's extremely controversial, obviously, but very much in keeping with Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest. And so his tests measured a variety of things, not even all of them had to do with intelligence: reaction time, sensory acuity, muscular power, and body proportions. And so these measures did not really line up. Like people who scored well in body proportions maybe didn't score well in reaction time. There really wasn't any correlation, any G factor like we talked about yesterday. This was not very scientific, but he did give us the phrase nature versus nurture, which is cool. And he did believe that genius was inherited. And even though most people today believe that genius is inherited, they also believe that it's environment, so it's nature and nurture. All right, so on the other end of the spectrum is Alfred Binet. And this is the guy that came up with what is now the IQ test, the Stanford Binet test. But he initially was testing French school children to determine which children were at risk for being behind in school. And so he came up with a variety of reasoning problems and problem-solving questions that he tested on his own two daughters. And then he tested using the same problems on children who were really bright and then children who were really behind. And the items that were answered correctly would then predict how other French children would handle their schoolwork. But again, the point of his test initially was to figure out who was at risk in Parisian schools. And so that is what he was doing when he came up with this. Like I said, unlike Galton, he did not buy into the hereditary genius. He would have been more on the nurture side. So it's nurture that determines how intelligent you are. It's how well educated your parents are, or how much your parents make you read, or what environment you're living in. And so the IQ test figures out what your mental age is. That is based on the reasoning and problem solving questions. And then it figures out, well, obviously it knows already what your chronological age is. And so on the modern day IQ test, if you take a test and they're like, hey, mentally you're 8 years old. If mentally you're 8 years old and you were actually 8 years old, then you put that number 8 over 8, which equals 1, and then they times it by 100, so that would equal 100. That is the average IQ score. And so basically all this does is it takes your mental age, puts it over your chronological age, and then times it by 100. All right, so this test was modified a little bit by Stanford University professor Lewis Terman, and he took Binet's test and adapted it, and this became the IQ test. He didn't call it that, but this is what it became. And so what Terman found was that when he applied the Paris-developed questions and age norms with California school children, it didn't really line up. The French norms did not go with the California kids. So he adapted some of the original items, added some others, and came up with new age norms. He also extended the age range from teenagers to what he called superior adults. And so the modification that he came up with is now called the Stanford-Binet test. All right, so it was actually a German psychologist, William Stern, who gave it this term, IQ, intelligence quotient is what that stands for. And like I said a second ago, the way that they come up with this number is that they take your mental age. So like I'm 36. Let's say that I take a test and they're like, hey, mentally you're 36. So they take the 36, they put it over my actual age, which is 36, that equals 1. They times it by 100. Therefore, 100 is considered the average. This type of testing was actually used by the government in World War I. They tested arriving immigrants, so immigrants who were coming into the country, and they also tested army recruits. And so this is actually the first time in the world that they gave like a mass test to a group of people. So the world's first mass administration of an intelligence test. Binet probably would have not liked the fact that his test was used this way. One of his greatest fears was that his test would be used to label people or to put them in a box, rather than helping them, identifying their weaknesses, and then being able to help them. But this was used to figure out how intelligent immigrants were and army recruits during World War I. All right, so psychologist David Wechsler created what is actually now the most widely used intelligence test, and this is called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. And it actually has a version for school-age children and preschool children. And there are 15 subtests that look at a couple of different things. It looks at similarities. This would be a question like, in what way are wool and cotton alike? So they're looking for commonalities between two objects or two concepts and asking children or adults or preschool kids, whoever they're testing, if they can pull out similarities. It also tests vocabulary. People are asked to name pictures or objects or to define words. Block design. This is visual abstract processing. This would be like when they give you, you know, those things where you have like certain patterns and then they give you a paper and you have to take the blocks and put them in the pattern that you see on the paper. That's kind of confusing. There's a picture of it in your book on page 635 if you're interested. But basically you can look at an image and put blocks in that shape is what block design is. and they also look at letter number sequence. And so if you hear a series of numbers or letters, you can just repeat them back in ascending order, or the letters back in alphabetical order. And obviously this test works a little bit differently for adults than it does for children. But the goal of this is, like Binet's test, to figure out where children or adults or whoever needs opportunities for improvement. And it also identifies their strengths that their teachers or whoever can build upon. All right, so good tests have three things. The first thing that it has is standardization. And this is simply that there are uniform testing procedures, and there are scores where you can compare a person's score with other people's score. And typically this is laid out in a bell curve or a normal curve. And this is what it looks like. You have a majority of the scores within 15 points of 100. We already said that 100 is the average IQ score, and you have the most people scoring 100. And then if you take it out a little bit, you have 68% of the population that score within 15% of that 100. And then as you move out to the extremes, it is less and less. Intelligence tests are periodically re-standardized to keep up with the norms. And so the AP exams actually do this as well. Each year, they'll change some things around so that they get about the same average of 3s, 4s, and 5s as they do every year. Interestingly, scores have increased since 1910. This is called the Flynn effect because it was discovered by a New Zealander called James Flynn. That was his name. And so what he found was that the average intelligence score in 1920 was much lower than it is in much lower than it was in 1990. So on average in 1920, people were scoring a 75. On average in 1990, people were scoring almost 100. And there's a lot of speculation about what causes the Flynn effect, why all of a sudden, 70 years later, are people scoring so much higher. And people have thrown out all sorts of suggestions. Is it because we have greater educational opportunities? Is it because we have families that have less children, and so therefore parents are able to focus on their 1 or 2 kids instead of trying to raise like 6 or 7 kids? Is it rising living standards, better income, more books available in the home? We don't know. Flynn said that as society has evolved and people have had to cope mentally with a modern society, it's caused them to perform better on IQ tests. We don't know for sure, but that is what he thought. So secondly, a good test is reliable. This simply means that the scores are consistent. You can check a test's reliability in a couple of ways. The first one is just to give the same test several times. So you test people many times to see if they get the same score or around the same score. Another way that you can do it is you can split the test in half. And so, for instance, you could give, in the first version of the test, you give them all of the odd questions. And then in the second part of the test, you give them all of the even questions. And the goal of that is to test to see that the test is reliable. And obviously, if the scores that you get the first time you take it and the second time you take it are the same, then the more reliable your test is. That is not staggered. Oh well. The third thing you need for a good test is validity. And validity just means that the test measures what it's supposed to measure. There's a couple of ways that this is looked at. Number one is content validity. Like on the AP US history exam, they are trying to gauge how much you learned in AP US history. And theoretically, if it was a valid test, they would pull from a good sample of the material that was covered in AP US history. As you know, a lot of times they go for random topics, and it's not a good sample. But if a test has content validity, then it means whatever has been learned and is being tested there's a good sample of it on the test, and it doesn't pick like 2 or 3 random things and test on that. Predictive validity predicts future performance. An intelligence test is an example of this. Unfortunately, intelligent tests are not very predictive of people over the age of 12. When you're looking at elementary school age children, typically the kids who score well on intelligence tests also do really well in school. So it's a really good predictor of how well kids perform in school. But as children hit middle school and then go to high school and college, intelligence tests are less predictive as time goes on. All right, so that is all for today. I hope you are having a great Tuesday. I miss you. I love you guys. And don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.